Okay, so Genesis chapter 29 ends with Jacob's household in a bit of a mess. He had two wives who happened to be sisters. It wasn't really Jacob's choice. He'd been swindled by his uncle, the girl's father. But truth be told, Jacob did have a choice in the matter. Though conned by his uncle Laban into marrying the older sister Leah when Jacob thought he was marrying the younger, Rachel, who he was head over heels in love with, Jacob could have accepted that he'd been conned and stayed with just Leah. But he didn't. Laban was more than happy to let Jacob work another 7 years for Rachel, since Jacob was a highly skilled and obviously blessed by God shepherd. Laban was getting rich off Jacob. He didn't care what kind of turmoil the sister wives might create for his nephew, or the pain it would cause his daughters to constantly vie for the affection of their husband. We don't often mention this when studying this passage, but Jacob must have been a pretty special specimen of a man for the sisters Leah and Rachel to be willing to overlook the obvious challenges and complexities they surely knew were before them by being the wives of the same man. The Bible gives little hint of the physical appearance of almost all of its characters, but I think it's safe to assume that Jacob was supremely attractive by the standards of that time and place. And beyond that, he was intelligent, clever, extremely skilled as a tender of flocks and herds. He must have possessed a personal charm and charisma that proved, supremely attractive. Though they were fraternal twins, Jacob's brother Esau is described as a manly man. So it's reasonable to assume that Jacob was as well, though his interests were more on the domestic front than his out-in-the-field hunting brother, Esau. Remember, Jacob arrived in Haran at his uncle Laban's home virtually empty-handed. Yet it didn't take long before both Leah and Rachel were pleased to be his wives. That says something about his overall appeal. Well, chapter 29 closes with Leah, the older sister and first wife, having 4 sons in quick succession: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. After these 4, Leah stopped having kids. All that time, Rachel had none, though, of course, Jacob and she were trying. The birth of each son to Leah only made Rachel's disappointment more keen and painful, and so she came up with a plan to compensate. Verse 1. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." I speak from the experience of a pastor of 40 years. When women become envious of one another, it ain't pretty. What I've never seen and am supremely thankful for is that envy between sisters sharing the same husband, living in the same house. Now, based on what we know of Leah and Rachel, I'm sure that Leah probably thought something like, if only I was beautiful and had my husband's affection like Rachel. Well, Rachel thought, if only I had sons like Leah. How much of our lives do we spend in pointless envy, longing for what others have and failing to enjoy what's ours? Rachel threw her frustration at Jacob. Now, the grammar makes it clear that she didn't say this once. She kept saying this. Rachel is peeved and blames her barrenness on her husband, on Jacob, which is silly because obviously the problem isn't with him, as Leah's 4 boys prove. Well, anger provokes anger, and so, verse 2, and Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Now, it seems that Jacob has a sense of what's going on. He reasons that as God had closed his grandmother Sarah's and mother Rebekah's wombs, he's closed Rachel's. Now, Rachel isn't going to let something like God's will stop her, verse 3. And so she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." So does this sound familiar? Surrogacy was the solution to barrenness that Sarah had come up with Abraham. If she couldn't have kids, her handmaid Hagar could step in as a surrogate. And who knows, it may have been that Jacob, rehearsing his family's history to Leah and Rachel, had planted this idea in her mind. The problem is Hagar's surrogacy hadn't worked out so well. How will it work out now? Verse 4. Then she gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife. Stop there. Bilhah did not become an official third wife. Jacob just used her as though she was, at Rachel's urging. Now think about that for a moment and realize what it means. There are a couple of forces at work here that we probably should consider. First, Rachel was so eager, so desirous of children, she was willing to do what? Let her husband have sex with another woman. As we noted when looking at Sarah's insistence that Abraham use Hagar as a surrogate mother, in that culture, any child born to Hagar would be counted as Sarah's. If Sarah consented, indeed, if Sarah initiated such surrogacy, any child born to the surrogate was deemed hers. But it meant that her husband would be having sex with another woman. And I don't care how socially acceptable such surrogacy was deemed at that time. That had to be an agony for Sarah or any other woman in her position. But all of this shows us just how important children were to that culture. It was everything, especially sons, because they carried on the family name. It was to sons that the estate went, not daughters, except in the rarest of occasions. And second, remember what Leah had said as each of her 4 sons were born, that surely now Jacob's heart would cleave to her. She assumed, because she was giving him what was so highly treasured at that time, that Jacob's affection for Rachel would swing to her. And apparently Rachel feared that very thing would happen. Thus, her suggestion of using Bilhah as a surrogate so Rachel could give Jacob a child. We see that in verse 3 when she says, "She will bear a child on my knees." You see, when it came time for Bilhah to deliver, she would literally sit on Rachel's lap so that when the child was born, Rachel was as close as possible and the child would come from seemingly between her legs. Thus, Rachel was accounted as the mother. And third, honestly, while Rachel and Leah were in agony over the affection of their shared husband, there was most likely something in Jacob as a man, as a male, kind of dug this. He had women fighting over being his bed partner. Well, we read on in verse 4, "And Jacob went into her." That phrase, "so he went into her," it's used 7 times in Genesis, always of sexual intimacy. But the phrase does not directly mean sexual intercourse. It means that the man went into the tent where the woman was waiting for him so they could be sexually intimate. It's kind of a play on words. I'll let you figure out the meaning of it. It's pretty obvious. Verse 5, "So Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son." Now watch this, verse 6. "Then Rachel said, 'God has judged my case, and he has heard my voice and given me a son.' Therefore she called his name Dan." Dan means judge. Now, there's a remarkable contrast in the way that Leah and Rachel go about naming their sons. In verses 31 through 35 of the previous chapter, chapter 29, Leah refers to God by his covenant name Yahweh. In naming her sons, Rachel uses the generic word for God, El. Only the people of promise can call God Yahweh. Anyone can call him El. Now imagine you're talking to someone that you've just met, and the subject of religion comes up, and the person you're speaking to says, "Oh, I believe in God." What have they really told you besides the fact that they're not an atheist? What God do they believe in? The God of the Bible, the God of the Christian faith, or some nebulous, abstract sky god, a creator? Now, if they said, "I believe in Jesus Christ," well, you'd have a much better sense of what God they believe in. Throughout history, it's Leah who comes across as Jacob's proper God-ordained wife. She's the one who's interested in the covenant and the promises. Rachel comes off as a petulant, spoiled brat. From the earlier description, she looked good, but her beauty was mostly just on the exterior. Well, Bilhah's not done having kids, which means that Jacob's not done using her as a surrogate. Verse 7, "And Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, 'With great wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed.' And so she called his name Naphtali." Naphtali means, you could probably guess it, wrestling. That captures the essence of what's going on in this family. It's war. Rachel regards all of this as a contest. Now, how she figures that she's ahead in that contest with 2 sons to Leah's 4 is a bit of a mystery. This may be a kind of boast that served as a wicked backhand to Leah, that her 2 sons from the loved wife were better than the 4 from the unloved wife. He thinks that's what Rachel's saying, and Leah takes her to mean by what she does next, verse 9. Then Leah saw that she had stopped bearing. She took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. So Leah takes a page from her sister's playbook and convinced Jacob to use her maid Zilpah as a surrogate. And of course, Jacob was more than happy to oblige because, again, he's a guy. Heck, maybe he counted the pitched battle between the sisters as a boon, a plus. Besides the varied sex, a bunch of kids are being born. Verse 10, and Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, a troop comes, and so she called his name Gad. Because, again, children born to Zilpah as a surrogate were reckoned as Leah's. And that's why, though it says that Leah gave Zilpah to Jacob as wife, it doesn't mean that Zilpah became his wife. She was just treated as one. If Bilhah and Zilpah were reckoned as real wives of Jacob, the children that they bore would have been counted as theirs, not Rachel's and Leah's. And it turns out that as time passes, those children, pretty much will be reckoned as theirs, but not at first. Now, Zilpah's first son by Jacob is named Gad, meaning good fortune. Leah foresees more children by Zilpah are on the way. Verse 12. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. And so she called his name Asher. And Asher means, of course, happy. Note how bitter the rivalry has become. Leah began naming her sons after her hopes and expectations in the Lord. Rachel's 2 surrogate sons are given competitive names, Judge, Wrestling. So Leah answers back, oh yeah? Well, I got good fortune and I'm happy. And now the kids get involved. This just gets better and better, doesn't it? Verse 14. Now Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, therefore he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. So what's the big deal with mandrakes? Well, they were thought to be a potent fertility medicine and an aphrodisiac. So they were called at that time love apples. Now we have no idea how the eldest son Reuben was at this point, but he found some mandrakes one day, brought them home to his mother Leah. Rachel saw them and pleaded with Leah to give them to her, thinking that they would allow her to conceive. It would seem that Jacob was staying in Rachel's tent at this point. He's no longer spending the night with Leah, and she's angry about it. And so Rachel agrees to rent him to Leah for a night if she will give her the mandrakes. And Leah agreed. Isn't this fun? Verse 16, when Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come into me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. So again, Jacob has got to be digging this. Not just for the sex, but because these women are fighting over him. That's a boost to any man's ego. You come home from work, your wife meets you in the front yard, grabs you by the shirt and says, come with me. You're all mine, you big hunk of burning love. It drags you into the house. No wonder Jacob was able to conceive another son. Verse 17, and God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son. Leah said, God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband. And so she called his name Issachar. Now, Issachar means reward. Verse 19, then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a 6th son. And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. And so she called his name Zebulun. Zebulun means dwelling. Verse 21, afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. And so Jacob now has 10 sons and a daughter. Dinah is the feminine form of the name Dan, which you may remember means judge. So after bearing Jacob's 6 children, Leah felt vindicated as the one who ought to have been esteemed by him as the real and his best wife. Now it's likely there were several unnamed daughters born to Jacob and his posse of wives and surrogates. Only one is mentioned because she becomes the center of a major story a bit later. But how likely is it that Jacob would have 10 sons before having a single daughter? And it seems like a bit of a stretch. So why aren't these other girls named? Well, most likely because they ended up married to other men outside the family and of concern to the story. Jacob's sons, on the other hand, well, they become the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. Verse 22, then God remembered Rachel and listened to her and opened her womb, and she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And so she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. In her desperation, Rachel finally turned to God and pleaded for children, and he rewarded her with a son named Joseph. Now, this name has two meanings, add and subtract. She hoped that Joseph was the first of more to come, the one who would subtract her barrenness by adding to her progeny. Now the story is going to shift from Leah's and Rachel's competition for Jacob's affection to Jacob's contest with his uncle Laban. Man, talk about a dysfunctional family. Verse 25, and it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you. Now, wait a minute. What's going on here? Jacob worked 7 years for Leah and got her as a wife. After only a week of a honeymoon with Leah, he gets Rachel, but then he has to work another 7 years to pay off the bride price for her. And it seems that he ended up working for Laban even after that first 14 years. But now he wants out. It's time to head home to Canaan. Surely by now Esau's cooled down, though his mother Rebekah has never sent word for him as she said that she would. Jacob knows it's way past the time that he headed back to the land and place that he was at one time so eager to gain as his inheritance. The problem is Laban's tied him to his family and to the region of Haran. And the problem is Jacob has nothing to show for all of the years that he's worked for his uncle. Laban's kept it all to and for himself. Jacob needs to put some wealth together to support his now large and thriving family. Verse 27. And Laban said to him, please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. And then he said, name me your wages and I will give it. So Laban was loath to let Jacob go because he'd grown rich off of him. It was obvious to the ever-conniving Laban that God blessed Jacob, and so he made an offer. Stay, build up his wealth and holdings before returning to Canaan. That way he won't return empty-handed. Now, the rest of the chapter is the arrangement that they hammered out. I'm just going to read it. It's pretty straightforward. Verse 29. So Jacob said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now when shall I also provide for my own house? So he, that is Laban, said, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. Let me pass through all your flocks today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. And so my righteousness will answer for me in the time to come, when the subject of my wages comes before you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. And Laban said, oh, that it were according to your word. And so he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hand of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob will stay on as the keeper of Laban's flocks. He begins by separating the sheep and the goats into 2 flocks, the monotone, one-color animals and those that are multicolored, the spotted and striped. The multicolored flock will be watched over by Laban's sons, who take them a 3 days' journey away so there won't be any interbreeding. Jacob will then lead the monotone, single-colored flock. Any animals born to them that are spotted or multitoned will be Jacob's. So after they've been weaned, they'll likewise be separated out, but put under the care of Jacob's sons so they won't interbreed. Now Laban agreed to all of this because he knew that monotone sheep are likely to produce monotone offspring. The thing is, it didn't turn out that way. Jacob used some tricks to increase the chance that spotted sheep would be born. Verse 37. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which is in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. And so the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaked, speckled, and spotted. So this is Jacob being Jacob all over again, conniving. He's practicing something the ancients believed about how an animal is formed. They believed that whatever its parents were looking at when it was conceived would affect its appearance. Jacob wanted spotted and streaked sheep, and so he put multicolored branches in the watering troughs. He knew that when female sheep drank, that's when the males would often mount them. And since the female would be staring at multicolored branches, she'd conceive a spotted or streaked lamb. And in fact, that's what they gave birth to, in an inordinately high number of multicolored sheep. But not because of Jacob's shenanigans. We know from genetics, while monotone sheep tend to produce monotone offspring, the gene for multicolored offspring is present, though it's recessive. They still produce spotted lambs, just not as many as monotone. It wasn't Jacob's branches that caused Laban's flock to produce a lot more than the usual spotted sheep. God simply moved the recessive gene into the more prominent role, which of course is easy peasy for God. Verse 40, then Jacob separated the lambs, that is the spotted lambs, as was the arrangement with Laban, and made the flocks face toward the streaked and all the brown and in the flock of Laban. But he put his own flocks by themselves and did not put them with Laban's flock. So Jacob set his flock of spotted sheep across from Laban's flock, so that when they came to drink, they had to look at Jacob's spotted flock. And then we get another bit of information going back to earlier when Jacob used the branches in the water trek, verse 41. And it came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed the rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the flocks were feeble, he did not put them in, so the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. So, simply stated, Jacob practiced some selective breeding. When healthier sheep came to drink, he encouraged the reproduction, but didn't the weaker sheep. Verse 43, thus the man became exceedingly prosperous and had large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Now, the Hebrew literally says that the man burst out exceedingly. Jacob wasn't blessed because of the clever manipulation of Laban's herds. He was blessed because God is gracious and chose to bless him. Now let's be clear. Jacob's conniving and attempts to finagle himself into blessing almost blew everything up back home in Canaan. Now, he's met his conniving match in his uncle Laban, but he tries to even up the score in this deal with the flocks. Though the branches in the watering trough thing that Jacob contrived had nothing to do with what kind of sheep were born, Laban's sons saw what he was doing, and as we'll see in the next chapter, regarded it as cheating. They told their dad, and Laban was steamed. Jacob's conniving ended up souring their relationship, so he ended up having to leave on the sly. Friends, God wanted to bless Jacob and had promised to back in Bethel years before. All Jacob's striving and conniving did was complicate and delay the blessing. Listen, God loves you. He wants to bless you. Let him. Don't envy others as Leah and Rachel did. Just enjoy what God has given you. Don't calculate how to maneuver yourself into blessing by playing the lotto, going to Las Vegas, and laying down a bet on a roulette table. Stop giving God reasons to love and to bless you. Instead, just open to him to do whatever he wants when he wants.